suspended.
Without objection.
And consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this last Sunday I was watching an ABC morning news show, and Christiane Amanpour was interviewing the Speaker of the House, John Boehner of Ohio. And Speaker Boehner was asked a number of questions, but the one he clearly wanted to focus on was what he called the Republican Jobs Program. And he handed to Ms. Amanpour a laminated card, which he said was the Republican Jobs Program that had passed the House of Representatives and was dying here in the Senate. It had never been called for passage. And so it struck me as odd, because I missed that during the course of this last year, that there was a Republican Jobs Program. And I was a little bit worried, because we're looking for every opportunity we can to create jobs. And so I came back and said to my staff, can you get a copy of this laminated card? I want to see what's written on it. Well, they produced the card for me and took a look at it. And as a result of it, I would have to say that the Republican view on how to create jobs and move the economy forward is considerably different than my own, and considerably different than the views of most Americans. Because what the Republicans have proposed doing is eliminating rules and regulations. They believe that's what's holding back the growth of the American economy. One of the areas that they particularly focused on is known as the Dodd-Frank bill, the Wall Street reform bill. Some of us are not suffering from political amnesia. We can recall what happened just a few years ago all across America, when at the end of the Bush administration we faced some of the worst choices I've ever heard, when we were presented an opportunity by the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Paulson, to literally bail out the Wall Street banks and major institutions to the tune of almost $800 billion for mistakes they had made. And we were given an ultimatum. If we didn't do it, we could see a collapse of our American economy and the global economy. And so many of us reluctantly voted for that, believing that we had no choice. And what we did was to send billions of dollars to banks up in Wall Street that had made serious mistakes, creating credit default swaps and derivatives, creating offices in London that could skirt the American laws, and literally hanging the American economy out to dry. The net result of that, of course, is that all across America, people suffered. Individuals lost their savings and their retirements. Families were facing hardship when they were laid off and faced unemployment. Businesses closed and restructured and downsized. The whole economy suffered because of what was clearly wrongdoing on the part of our financial community. As a result of that, President Obama said, we need to change the rules and laws in America so that there will be adequate oversight so that we never get in this mess again. The first amendment on the Dodd-Frank bill in the Senate was offered by Senator Boxer of California, and she said, this is the end of too big to fail. We're never walking down this path again. So we put the financial institutions and corporations of America on notice that we were not going to bail them out in the future should they make another colossal mistake at the expense of workers and families and businesses across America. Then we went through the entire regulatory law as it related to Wall Street, the stock exchanges, and all of the exchanges across America, and said, what do we need to do to make certain that there's transparency, that the banks that were over-leveraged, loaning far more than they should, are in a position where they're fiscally sound, financially sound, and how do we put cops on the beat on Wall Street through the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission to guard against this sort of thing ever occurring again. We offered that as Wall Street reform, with the support of President Obama, but without the support of a single Republican senator or congressman. Not one. Not one would support us in this effort. We passed it anyway. The President signed it. It's now being implemented, moving forward, and I think long overdue. Well, it turns out that that's one of the first things that the Republicans now want to eliminate in their effort to build the American economy. Well, I can tell you, we would be building the American economy on a foundation of sand if we did it. If we ignored the experience we had just a few years ago when we were forced into this bailout situation, sending billions to the biggest bankers in America and having them turn around and declare bonuses for their top officers and employees, if we would ignore that reality and that history and say that we were going to follow the Republican lead and eliminate this oversight of Wall Street, it would just invite another economic disaster. But yes, that is one of the House Republican planks for rebuilding the American economy. The financial crisis of 2008 wiped out 8 million jobs in America. 24 million Americans today are still suffering, unemployed or underemployed. Millions of families have lost their homes. The report in the Chicago newspapers this morning was stunning and troubling. Almost 50% of the homes in our region in Chicago are underwater. What it means is families have borrowed more in their mortgages than their home is currently valued. That is a troubling development, but it is a reality. It reflects what happened when the over-anxious and overinflated real estate market got out of hand. We don't want that to happen again. And if we're going to avoid it, we have to have appropriate oversight and regulation. Many families have seen their home values plummet, not just in Chicago, but nationwide. Their retirement savings have been cut in half over the last 4 years. In Illinois and across America, solid, well-run companies, many in business for decades, have been shaken to the core by the lack of credit and the lack of customers. So what do our Republican colleagues offer as a solution? What is the Republican jobs plan? Incredibly, they have responded to America's economic crisis not by rethinking their deregulation dogma, but by doubling down. Let me explain. In addition to repealing Wall Street reform, Republicans are trying to change the most basic protections we have in America for clean air and pure drinking water. Think about this. The Republican majority in the House has voted 168 times this year, 168 times, to undercut clean air and clean water laws and to block efforts to limit global warming, protect public health, protect the public lands that we've been left by previous generations, and guard against things like future oil spills. 168 times just this year, and they're not finished. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have attached more than 50 anti-environmental policy writers so far to spending bills for next year. They're unrelenting. I won't go into all of the environmental and public health protections the Republicans are trying to block. Let me focus on two. Republicans have used the Senate's Rule 14 to place bills blocking these two new rules directly on the Senate calendar rather than going through the regular order. It's their right to do that. They are saying, in effect, we don't have time for the normal rules. We don't have time to hear from the scientists or the American people. We need to bury these rules right now. The first rule they want to delay is the Boiler MACT rule, the MACT rule. It's an acronym that stands for Maximum Achievable Control Technology. The Boiler MACT rule would reduce the amount of mercury, dioxins, acid gases, and other toxic pollutants that can be emitted by large industrial boilers and solid waste incinerators. Is that the key to building jobs in America? Large industrial boilers spewing more toxic chemicals into the air? Solid waste incinerators burning without the regulation to protect the people that happen to live downwind? These chemicals can cause cancer, heart, lung, and kidney disease, damage to eyes and skin, impair brain development in children and babies, and learning ability, and they can kill people. That's a fact. The other new clean air rule in the crosshairs from the Republicans is the so-called cross-state air pollution rule. It would require significant reductions in two toxic chemicals, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide, released by electric power plants. These chemicals not only cause sickness and death, they can spread hundreds of miles downwind and across state lines. Many states can't develop new jobs and industries because they've reached their air pollution limits under national clean air standards, but not because of what they're doing in their states, but rather for the wind that's blowing from other states with pollution. What puts them over the limit are emissions that travel from old, coal-burning power plants in other states. That's not right, and it's not fair. The cross-state air pollution rule would set new limits on sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions and establish an emissions cap-and-trade system for 31 eastern states and the District of Columbia. It's a reasonable, market-based solution to a serious public health threat. The Republicans would abolish it. Both the Boiler-Mac rule and the cross-state air pollution rule replace rules that were developed by the EPA as far back as the Bush administration, rules that were stricken by the D.C. Circuit Court. In both cases, the court ordered the EPA to come up with a new rule. House Republicans have already passed a bill to delay these new air pollution quality standards for at least 15 months, and here in the Senate they would delay them for up to 5 years. As for the cross-state air pollution rule, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky has introduced a resolution of disapproval to just kill it altogether, so there'll be no standard. So that if you happen to live downwind from a polluting power plant and your state is trying to do its best to clean up its act, it's to no avail. The air pollution quality will be so bad in your state because of your neighboring state that you are going to face serious problems and restrictions in your own development. The House has taken an even more radical approach. They voted almost entirely along party lines, passing a Republican bill called the Train Act that would delay indefinitely the cross-state air pollution rule and another life-saving rule, the mercury and toxic standards, air toxic standards. The Train Act would also overturn the legal requirement that EPA's public health rules be based on the best advice of scientists, not the demands of politicians or their donors. It's the most serious attack on the Clean Air Act since the law was passed 40 years ago under Republican President Richard M. Nixon. President Obama has already said he's going to veto any bills that would delay the new clean air rules, and our Republican colleagues know they don't have the vote to override his veto. So once again, they're forcing the Senate to debate measures they know have no chance, zero chance, of becoming law. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Republican jobs plan. Republicans say federal agencies should analyze the cost to business of every new regulation, whether it's meant to protect against Wall Street recklessness, offshore oil disasters, lead-based toys, or killer cantaloupes. If a regulation hurts the corporate bottom line, the Republicans argue it shouldn't be passed. I have a counterproposal for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Any politician who proposes deregulating an industry ought to be required to tell the public how much money deregulation would cost, how many jobs might be lost, how many lives might be cut short, how many children and other members of our family will end up in the hospital, and how much of our nation's natural treasures might be scarred or destroyed. Let's have an honest assessment on both sides of the ledger. Mr. President, when I travel across my state, much like your state, we have big cities, small towns, and I go to schools. And I talk to the kids, and usually, you know, they have the common questions, do you have a limousine, how much money do you make, and things that kids will ask you. And so I ask questions back to them. And one question I've started asking at every school is the following. How many of you know someone who is suffering from asthma? Without fail, more than half the hands will go up. In Mount Sterling, Illinois, a small farm town down in Brown County in downstate Illinois, half the hands went up. I guarantee you, every classroom in the city of Chicago, more than half the hands will go up. Asthma has become epidemic in America, and it is related to many things, including the quality of the air that we breathe. On the south side of Chicago, it's hard to find a child who doesn't suffer from asthma. In 2007, the cost of asthma-related hospitalizations in Illinois totaled $280 million. The average stay cost $15,000 for an asthma case, and nearly 60% of those hospital costs were paid for by taxpayers through Medicaid and Medicare. Air pollution makes asthma worse. If we reduce air pollution, we can reduce asthma attacks and asthma-related death and save taxpayers tens of billions a year just in the cost of treating that single disease. That's something you never hear when the disciples of deregulation start preaching. Here are some other facts you won't hear about deregulation from the deregulation devotees. The new Boiler-Mac rule will create jobs, not eliminate them. It would prevent between 2,500 and 6,500 premature deaths each year, and it would save between $22 billion and $54 billion a year in health care costs. The cross-state air pollution rule, which they would also abolish, would also net thousands of new jobs, prevent 400,000 cases of aggravated asthma and 34,000 premature deaths each year, saving $280 billion in health care costs. In my state alone, The cross-state rule will save 1,500 lives a year and provide enough public health benefit to save our state $12 billion. $12 billion in Illinois. That's more than Illinois spent on health, hospitals, and highways combined in the year 2009. Deregulation is a costly gamble, even for businesses that are deregulated. During the last administration, oil companies were allowed to self-regulate under the Bush administration. How did that work in the Gulf of Mexico with British Petroleum? The Gulf oil spill is the worst industrial environmental disaster in U.S. history. Congratulations, self-regulators. Local businesses suffered $4 billion to $12 billion in lost income because of self-regulation by a major oil company. BP alone is likely to spend $40 billion in claims, fines, and other expenses from this historic, awful spill. Now, those who push for deregulation tell us environmental rules are job killers, nothing but a burden on businesses and consumers. They're wrong. Regulations that are well-designed are, to borrow a phrase from Republican friends, job creators. They can spur innovation, create new products, new jobs, even whole new industries. A study published by the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, estimates that new air pollution rules for electric power plants, quote, will provide long-term economic benefits across much of the United States in the form of highly skilled, well-paid jobs through infrastructure investment. Specifically, researchers found that clean air investments could create 1.5 million new jobs in 2015 right here at home. Mr. President, let me tell you, bring this story closer to home. Just recently, I made a trip in Illinois to a new coal-fired plant. It's a plant that is amazing. It's called the Prairie State Energy Campus, and it's owned by a number of electric cooperatives. It has $1 billion investment in the clean use of coal to produce electricity. They took a look at the law, and instead of hiring lawyers to fight it, they hired engineers to comply with it. And the plant is up and running. It is a marvel to behold. And right across from this plant is a coal mine. And the coal that is drawn from that mine goes into this plant and meets all the specifications required today by the EPA. The people who are running this plant are not whining and crying and begging for relief. They rolled up their sleeves and built a plant much cleaner than anything that exists in the United States, and they are proving it can be profitable. I wish my Republican friends would come to the Prairie State Energy Campus. They should see and know that 4,000 union jobs were created for the construction of this plant. And they expect to have 500 permanent local jobs to boost the Illinois economy by $785 million a year with our own local coal. The campus includes 2 generators that will produce 1,600 megawatts of clean, low-cost energy for more than 2.5 million customers in the Midwest. It's going to go online by the end of this year. By using the latest technology, carbon dioxide emissions will be 15% lower than what is typically discharged. In addition, the plant's going to save an estimated 200,000 tons of carbon dioxide each year by using coal from an adjacent mine instead of mining it in some other place and shipping it to the site of the power generation. 160 coal miners are working in the adjacent mine. I went there. It's not my first visit to a coal mine, but it's always an eye-opener to go in there and see how they mine coal today. 2 weeks ago, Prairie State announced plans to hire even more miners. In Illinois, incidentally, coal miners make a pretty decent wage, $65,000 a year. So these are good jobs right here in America, mining coal to be used in a clean coal plant. It can be done. The Republicans ought to acknowledge it can be done. And new jobs are being created in the process while we're reducing air pollution. Mr. President, in a recent survey, 2 out of 3 Americans said they support new clean air rules and oppose what the Republicans are trying to do in the name of job creation. Nearly 90% of all Americans, nearly 60% of Republicans and conservatives, I might add, said Congress should not prevent the EPA from enforcing the new rules. I wish that my Republican friends, who are so dead set on eliminating these standards for air and water pollution, would listen to the people across America who want cleaner air and pure drinking water and are willing to see reasonable regulation to reach those goals. The push to kill new clean air rules isn't just coming from the American people. It's part of a huge power grab. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Republicans in Congress have launched an unprecedented anti-regulation campaign. The Chamber is reportedly spending millions of dollars to push the message that regulations are job killers. Their goal is to roll back existing environmental, health, financial, and other regulatory protection and to block any new protection. They are using the American job crisis to try to push through an agenda that will increase our deficit, actually take away jobs in America, and cause thousands of Americans to get sick and some to die. Just to cut taxes on millionaires and billionaires and get rid of government regulation, and they believe we can get the economy humming again. That's their credo. Madam President, if that were true, the last administration would have been the most prosperous in our history, because that is the message and philosophy and agenda that guided the Bush administration. Instead, in the words of the Wall Street Journal, not exactly a Democratic publication, George W. Bush's administration produced the worst jobs record on record. We've tried this. It doesn't work. We've seen this movie. We know how it ends. This notion of protecting millionaires from any taxes and repealing any laws related to the regulation of our economy just didn't work under the Bush administration and shouldn't be tried again. Madam President, the reason 2 million Americans are out of work has nothing to do with excessive financial or environmental regulation. If anything, our economy is hurting because we don't have the appropriate regulation in place now to avoid the excesses of the past. To say that we can't create jobs without creating dangerous levels of toxic chemicals in our air and water is an absolutely false choice. We've got to find an approach that protects the health of American families and balances the needs of business and is based on the reality of science. For 40 years, Democrats and Republicans used to work together on this agenda. We need to do it again. In the meantime, if our Republican colleagues want to create good middle-class jobs here at home, let's pass the President's American Jobs Act. This will not only create jobs, it will fund infrastructure and road repairs. It will cut payroll taxes for working families, saving the average family about $1,500 a year, and extend badly needed unemployment benefits to those out of work. It keeps hundreds of thousands of teachers in the classroom and cops and firefighters on the job in our neighborhoods and communities. That's the way to create good jobs. America doesn't need dirty water and dirty air to create good-paying jobs. I hope the Republican agenda, even if it's laminated on a card passed out by Speaker John Boehner, will realize that we can do better in this country by not compromising our public health and the great nation that we live in. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to take a moment to honor and thank those who have earned the noble title of veteran. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month marked the end of World War I. Since then, this date has been celebrated first as Armistice Day and now as Veterans Day. But no matter what we call it, it serves the purpose of honoring our nation's heroes, those who served in the military, our veterans. As the son of a World War II veteran who served as a waist gunner on B-17s, I grew up in a family with values rooted in military tradition. My father remained in the military and retired until he retired from the Air Force as a master sergeant after 20 years of service. At an early age, my brother, my sister, and I were taught about the sacrifices our men and women make in uniform. Growing up in this environment gave us an understanding of the unique challenges that military families face, an understanding that guides my efforts today. My mom would continually remind me of my responsibility as a public servant to keep our promises to those who served our nation in uniform. Up until her recent passing, one of the first questions she would ask whenever I saw her would inevitably be, "What have you done for veterans lately?" I was always able to answer that question with a clean conscience while serving in the House and now in the Senate. Despite how divided we can be on other issues, Democrats and Republicans come together more often than not to pass policies that will enhance the quality of life for both our veterans and their families. Today in the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, we are working to secure the benefits our veterans deserve and improve existing benefits to meet the needs of more than 23 million American veterans, including 257,000 who call Arkansas home. The most important thing for all of us to remember is the reason that we are working to improve veterans' benefits, the men and women of our armed forces and their families. Through their selfless sacrifice, we are protected from our enemies. They make the United States a safer place to live. They have heard our nation's call and met the challenge with their service. It's now up to us to ensure our veterans have access to all the opportunities that our great nation has to offer. Taking care of our veterans is the responsibility of every American. It is important that we all continue to serve our veterans and to reflect on those who served in conflicts around the globe, as well as those who are serving today in support of the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let us also reflect on the sacrifices of those who have given their last full measure of devotion. In September, I came to the Senate floor to honor the lives of 5 Arkansans who were killed in action this year. Last week, sadly, we lost the 6th member from Arkansas this year. Specialist Serena N. Butcher followed in the footsteps of her grandfather and brother and joined the military in April of 2010. As a member of the Oklahoma National Guard, she served as an automated logistical specialist, but her ultimate goal was to become a nurse. At the tender age of 19, this Crossett, Arkansas native and mother to a beautiful little girl was killed in an IED explosion in Afghanistan on November 1st. We are grateful for her service and her sacrifice. We are forever indebted to her and every American who has worn the uniform and sacrificed their own safety and security for that of the American people. Every day, the men and women of our armed forces stand in defense of our nation and our cherished way of life. They do so regardless of cost, fully aware that they may be called to pay the ultimate price for their country. This week, communities across the country gather to express our undying gratitude for those who have worn our nation's uniform. Let us always honor the service of those who have served and those on the front lines today as we address the important challenges facing the nation. To all of our veterans and their families, thank you on behalf of a grateful nation. And with that, I yield back, Madam President.
Madam President.
The Senator from Vermont.
Thank you very much. There are 2 issues that I would like to touch upon this afternoon. that I think are of very significant importance to the people of our country. Madam President, on Sunday, just 2 days ago, I held a town meeting in Montpelier, Vermont, on the issue of saving the Postal Service. And I was frankly stunned by the number of people who came. As you know, Vermont is not the largest state in the country, and yet we had some 350 people crowding into the cafeteria at Montpelier High School to say very clearly that they do not want to see the Postal Service dismembered. They do not want to see policies developed which will create a death spiral for the post offices of America. And we heard a lot of testimony from many people. And bottom line is that everybody in that room thought that it was terribly wrong that in the midst of a recession, the Post Office is talking about cutting 120,000 good-paying jobs in our country. Didn't make sense to anybody in that room. And I find it ironic that at a moment when appropriately enough, and I strongly support the effort, we're talking about creating jobs for veterans who are coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan with high unemployment rates. Many of the people who work in the Post Office are, in fact, veterans. So on one hand, we're trying to create jobs for veterans. On the other hand, if the Postal Service does what it wants, we may end up losing 120,000 jobs, including many for veterans. Madam President, I wanted to just touch on some of the important issues, I think, that we have to deal with regard to the Postal Service. And I want to just go over a letter that Senators Leahy, Gillibrand, and Wyden and myself sent to the chairpeople and ranking members of the Committee on Homeland Security and the subcommittee as well, and that is Senators Lieberman, Collins, Carper, and Scott Brown. These are the points that we made in our letter, and these are points that are going to be incorporated in legislation that I will be introducing this week, legislation that I think is common sense legislation, legislation that will help us create a business model so that the Postal Service can be successful, legislation that will save 120,000 jobs. And this is what we wrote in the letter to the Homeland Security Committee. First and foremost, and a lot of people don't know this, people say correctly, Postal Service is having problems because we're in a digital age. First-class mail is going down because people are emailing. That's true. Second of all, we're in the midst of a recession. Many businesses are facing problems. But the most important financial problem facing the Post Office today are not those issues. They are the issues of accounting approaches which have done great disservice to the Postal Service. The United States Postal Service uniquely has been forced to pre-fund 75 years' worth of future retiree health benefits in just 10 years. There is no other agency of government which comes close to that onerous requirement, nor do we believe there are any companies in the private sector that have been asked to do that. So you're asking the Postal Service to come up with a huge amount of money, put it into a fund in a way that no other agency of government, and we think no other private company, has been forced to do. This mandate costs the Postal Service between $5.4 and $5.8 billion per year, and it accounts for 100% of the Postal Service's $20 billion debt. Without that onerous requirement, the USPS would still have significant borrowing authority with the United States Treasury to ride out the tough economic times we are seeing in the recession. Furthermore, it's not only future retiree health benefits that they're being asked to come up and fund, but the USPS needs to recoup the overpayments that it has made to the CSRS and to the FERS, the Federal Retirement Systems. According to studies by the Hay Group and the Siegel Company, USPS has overpaid the CSRS by between $50 and $75 billion. So if you look at those two issues, if we can deal with those issues and treat the Postal Service fairly, we will have gone a very long way toward addressing the immediate financial crisis that the Postal Service is facing. Second of all, what we want to be very careful about as we develop business models for the future is not start cutting and creating a Postal Service which will no longer have customer support and lay the groundwork for literally a death spiral and the destruction and demise of the Postal Service in years to come. I come from a rural state, and post offices are extremely important to the people of small towns above and beyond getting mail. They become, in a sense, in some ways, the identifying feature of a small town. It's where people come together and they talk. It is very important, in my mind, not to pell-mell start cutting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small post offices in rural America. And the legislation that we will be offering this week addresses that problem in, I think, a sensible and reasonable way. Second of all, the Postal Service can never be competitive if when you drop a letter into a postal box, it takes 5 days for that letter to get to its destination. And one of the ideas that the Postal Service is talking about is making very significant cuts in what they call processing centers. That's where the mail is gathered and forwarded. And if you cut those centers, and in my state, we have two that are on the line, one in Essex Junction and one in Wright River Junction. And if you cut those and you cut other processing centers all over the country, what will happen is that when you drop that letter into a mailbox, it could take up to 5 days for that letter to reach its destination. And when you have that poor service, people simply are going to stop using the post office, and that continues the death spiral. People are not going to want to use the service. Thirdly, and in the same vein, the Postal Service is now talking about cutting Saturday delivery. And again, that means that there are a whole lot of folks who get prescription drugs on Saturday. There are a whole lot of people who get a magazine or newspapers on Saturday. You cut that back, and people are going to say, no, I don't want to deal with the post office anymore. It's not worth it. So it seems to me that the choice we have is to do what the Postal Service is now talking about, and that is cut and eliminate rural post offices, end Saturday mail delivery, cut out and eliminate significant numbers of processing centers which will slow down the delivery of mail. That is one approach. And lay off, by the way, some 120,000 American workers, including many veterans. I think that is a very bad idea. The other approach is to come up with a business model which recognizes that we are in the 21st century, that the post office has got to evolve and change, and give the post office the freedom to compete in a way that addresses the consumer needs of its customers. Let me give you an example. The presiding office comes from a rural state, as I do. A lot of people in our states want to get fishing licenses. They want to get hunting licenses. If that person walked into a post office in rural New Hampshire, rural Vermont, they say, hey, can I fill out an application and get a fishing license or a hunting license? Post office says, no, we don't do that. We don't do that. We're not allowed to do that. We're prescribed from doing that. If an individual literally wants to walk into a post office, and postmasters tell me this happens every day, and somebody says, look, I have a letter here, and I want it notarized. Could you please notarize it? They say, sorry, they may be a notary public. They're not allowed by law to notarize it. Now, the issue of the digital revolution is obviously impacting post offices not only in the United States but around the world. And other countries are looking at these challenges in a way that we are not. give you just one more example. For a lot of reasons, legal and otherwise, there are people who would like to see a document delivered to somebody in writing and not simply in email. There are post offices now in other countries where you can send an email, say from Vermont to California, it gets printed up, and on the same day that document gets delivered to a business or a home. Post office in America is not allowed to do that. So by law, our post office is restricted from entering the 21st century. If somebody walks into a post office now, they say, well, you know, I want to print up 10 copies of this document. I need 10 copies. Where's your copying machine? Postmaster says, we don't have a copying machine. We're not allowed to have a copying machine. So there are a lot of ideas that are out there that people are talking about as to how the Postal Service can address the needs of customers in the 21st century. Last but not least on this issue, one of the people at the town meeting on Sunday got up and said, you know, I just want to say this, that in our town, you know, we know our letter carrier very well. And our letter carrier noticed that mail remained in the mailbox of an elderly person. And the mailman got on the phone, called up the police department because he suspected that something was wrong. Turned out something was wrong, and that person's life was saved. I expect that happens all over this country. We've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of letter carriers who know people, who interact with people. They do play and can more so play an important role in providing services. So, bottom line, Madam President, is I think it is a bad idea in the midst of a recession to slash 120,000 jobs, including jobs of many of our veterans. Second of all, I do believe that if we use our brains and our entrepreneurial spirit, we can create a post office which is very relevant and can be profitable in the 21st century. We will be introducing legislation addressing all of these issues, and I hope very much that my colleagues will be co-sponsoring that legislation. Madam President, there is another issue that I wanted to talk about a little bit, and that is the work of the Super Committee. This country has a record-breaking deficit. It has a $14+ trillion national debt, and I think all of the American people, or virtually all, want to see the Super Committee come up with a proposal which makes sense and which helps us address our deficit crisis. And my suggestions to the Super Committee is they, in fact, can do that by simply doing what the American people want them to do. Now, I have heard some ideas out there where members of the Super Committee are talking about cutting Social Security, which has not contributed one nickel to our deficit and has a $2.5 trillion surplus. I've heard other ideas out there. We got to cut Medicare and we got to cut Medicaid. Well, got 50 million people without any health insurance. I don't think it's a brilliant idea to throw more and more people off of health insurance. So I think those are bad ideas, and every single poll that I have seen tells me that the American people agree that those are dumb ideas. Meanwhile, I have seen and talked to a whole lot of people who are asking me this question. They say, how is it that when the wealthiest people in this country are becoming much wealthier, when the effective tax rates of the top 2% are the lowest in decades, why isn't it that we're asking those people who are doing phenomenally well to start paying their fair share of taxes? And let me tell you something, this is not just a progressive idea, it is not just a democratic idea. What the polls suggest is all across the political spectrum, the American people are saying, yes, it is right and appropriate that the wealthiest people in this country start paying their fair share of taxes. And, Madam President, I would just mention to you that an ABC News Washington Post October 5th, 2011 poll, 75% of independents support raising taxes on millionaires. In that same poll, 57% of Republicans support raising taxes on millionaires. In that same poll, 55% of Tea Party supporters, supposedly the extreme right wing who want to abolish Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, turns out not to be the case at all. 55% of Tea Party supporters agree with raising taxes on millionaires. According to a June 2011 Washington Post poll, 72% of Americans support raising taxes on incomes over $250,000. So I think we know what the American people want. They do not want, in poll after poll, to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid because they know how vitally important those programs are to the well-being of tens of millions of Americans. For example, according to a February 2011 NBC News Wall Street poll, 77% of Americans are opposed to cutting Social Security to reduce the deficit. So where are we as a country? We're pretty united. We're in agreement. But the American people are saying the rich are getting richer, their effective real tax rates have gone down, they've got to pay more in taxes to help us do deficit reduction and create jobs. The American people also understand that there are huge corporate loopholes out there. Oil companies making money hand over fist, getting huge tax breaks. Wall Street getting huge tax breaks. We lose $100 billion a year because large companies and the wealthy put their money into tax havens in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and Panama. People of this country know that that's wrong. So I would hope very much, Madam President, that the Super Committee will do nothing more than listen to the American people. That's all. And if you do that, you're going to do the right thing. Don't cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Ask the wealthiest people in this country to start paying their fair share of taxes. Do away with these outrageous loopholes that large, profitable corporations enjoy. If you do that, we can in fact come up with an agreement that will help us reduce the deficit and will win the support of Democrats, Republicans, Independents. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be ended.
Without objection.
And I ask